The text message left his phone at 11:47 p.m., a quiet confession sent into the dark like a prayer he didn't expect anyone to answer. 3 simple words. I miss you. He stared at the screen for a second too long, thumb hovering, heart already aching in that dull, familiar way. Then the tiny "sent" appeared, and his stomach dropped. The name above the message wasn't Hannah. It wasn't the woman who had once fallen asleep on his shoulder in a hospital chair. It wasn't the mother of his son. It was Margaret Whitmore, CEO. If you were standing in that small kitchen in Cleveland, Ohio, with the refrigerator humming behind you and unpaid bills scattered across the counter, what would you have done? Would you have sent another text to explain? Would you have thrown the phone across the room? Or would you have done what Jacob did? Freeze, because some mistakes feel too big to fix. Jacob wasn't careless. He was exhausted. There's a difference. His days began at 5:15 a.m., long before the sun bled into Lake Erie, and ended whenever his 8-year-old son Caleb finally drifted to sleep. Between those hours, he packed lunches, braided messy brown hair that refused to lie flat, caught the bus to work, and tried to keep his job at Whitmore Logistics from slipping through his fingers like everything else in his life had. Hannah had died 3 years earlier. Breast cancer. Aggressive. The kind that turns life into a series of waiting rooms and whispered consultations. Jacob still remembered the exact shade of green on the hospital walls, and how Hannah squeezed his hand the night before her final surgery. Caleb had been 5 then, too young to understand why Mommy wasn't coming home, too young to understand why his father sometimes stared at nothing with tears in his eyes. Jacob had never planned on being a single father. He had never planned on learning how to sew superhero patches onto tiny backpacks or how to braid hair without pulling too tight. He had never planned on loneliness feeling like a physical thing that sat at the foot of his bed every night. But life doesn't ask for your plans. It just keeps moving. Whitmore Logistics was one of the largest shipping companies in the Midwest, headquartered in a glass building downtown that reflected the sky like it belonged to someone else's world. Margaret Whitmore had inherited it from her father and tripled its value in less than a decade. She was known for precision, discipline, and an unshakable focus. Her employees whispered that she could sense inefficiency before it happened. She rarely smiled. She almost never paused. Jacob worked in inventory management. Not glamorous, not high-paying, but stable. And stability was everything when you had a child who needed braces and school supplies and reassurance that monsters didn't exist under the bed. The text had been meant for Hannah's old number. He still hadn't deleted it. Sometimes, on nights when Caleb was asleep and the house was too quiet, he would scroll through their old messages. He would read the jokes, the grocery lists, the heart emojis she used too often. That night had been especially heavy. Caleb had asked, out of nowhere, whether Mommy would recognize him if she could see him now. Jacob had smiled and said of course she would. Then he had gone into the kitchen and typed 3 words he couldn't say out loud. I miss you. But he had scrolled too fast. The contact list had shifted after a recent company update. Margaret Whitmore's name, recently added when she sent a department-wide number for emergency reporting, sat exactly where Hannah's had once been. He didn't sleep that night. He imagined the next morning. He imagined being called into her office, the glass walls, the polished desk, the quiet humiliation. He rehearsed explanations that sounded flimsy even in his own head. At 9:02 a.m., his phone buzzed. He nearly dropped it. The message preview showed her name, Margaret Whitmore. He opened it slowly, like it might explode. Say it again. That was all it said. He read it 3 times. There was no anger, no reprimand, no confusion. Just those 3 words. Say it again. His chest tightened. Was she mocking him, testing him, or had she understood? He didn't reply. He couldn't. His hands were shaking too hard. Instead, he walked through the glass doors of the headquarters feeling like every step echoed louder than it should. The building smelled like polished floors and expensive coffee. Employees moved quickly, purposefully. Jacob felt like a smudge in a room full of clean lines. Around noon, his supervisor appeared at his cubicle. Margaret wants to see you. The sentence was calm, neutral, but Jacob felt heat crawl up his neck. He nodded and followed the hallway toward the corner office overlooking the city. When he stepped inside, Margaret Whitmore wasn't what he expected up close. Yes, she wore a tailored navy suit. Yes, her posture was straight, her silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, but her eyes were softer than he imagined. Tired, almost. She gestured for him to sit. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city skyline shimmered behind her, Lake Erie stretching wide and indifferent beyond the glass. Finally, she leaned forward slightly and said, in a voice so quiet it barely seemed to belong in a corporate office, "Say it again." He swallowed. His throat felt raw. He explained. The mistake, the old number, his wife, the hospital, the loneliness, the way some nights felt heavier than others. He didn't know why he kept talking. He just did. Words poured out of him, unpolished and unprofessional. When he finished, the room felt smaller. Margaret didn't interrupt once. She didn't check her phone. She didn't glance at the clock. She simply listened. Then she surprised him. She whispered that she had lost someone too. Not a spouse, but a daughter. A car accident on a rainy highway in Pennsylvania. She said that running the company had been easier than going home to an empty house. That board meetings were less painful than silence. She confessed that she sometimes opened her daughter's last voicemail just to hear her say hi. The room shifted then. It wasn't CEO and employee anymore. It was two human beings holding pieces of the same broken shape. She told him she had almost ignored the message, almost deleted it. But something about those words had stopped her. "I miss you." She hadn't heard anyone say that to her in years. What if someone accidentally texted you their deepest grief? Would you push them away? Or would you recognize your own reflection in it? Margaret made a decision that afternoon that rippled through more than just Jacob's life. She approved flexible hours for him without forcing him to beg. She connected him with a counselor through the company's benefits program. She asked HR to review childcare support options for single parents. None of it was dramatic. None of it made headlines. But to Jacob, it felt like someone had cracked open a window in a suffocating room. Weeks passed, then months. Jacob started arriving at work without that constant knot in his stomach. He picked Caleb up from school himself instead of paying a neighbor he could barely afford. He attended a school play for the first time without glancing at his watch. He even began volunteering for small projects at work, his confidence inching back slowly. Margaret noticed. She began walking through the departments more often, not just scanning reports but observing people. She learned names. She asked about families. She listened. The company culture shifted almost imperceptibly at first. Then undeniably. Productivity didn't drop. It rose. Turnover slowed. People stayed. One evening, months after the text, Jacob found himself back in his kitchen at 11:47 p.m. Caleb was asleep upstairs, clutching a stuffed dinosaur. The bills were fewer now. The silence still existed, but it no longer crushed him. His phone buzzed. It was Margaret. Just checking in. "How are you tonight?" He smiled faintly and typed back, honestly, missing her, but not drowning. A few minutes later, another message appeared. "That's progress." The following spring, Whitmore Logistics launched a foundation in honor of Margaret's daughter and Hannah. It funded grief counseling for employees and families. At the small dedication ceremony in the lobby, Jacob stood beside Margaret, both of them staring at a plaque with two names etched into metal. He felt something that surprised him. Not just sadness, not just longing, but gratitude. Life hadn't returned what it had taken. It never does. But it had offered something unexpected in its place. Connection. Understanding. A reminder that even in sterile offices and accidental messages, humanity can find a way through. Years later, Caleb would barely remember the details of the hardest nights. He would remember his father showing up. He would remember laughter slowly returning to their home. He would remember visiting the tall glass building downtown and feeling proud. And Jacob would always remember the night he made a mistake that felt catastrophic. The night 3 words traveled to the wrong person and somehow landed exactly where they were needed. Because sometimes healing doesn't arrive wrapped in certainty. Sometimes it comes disguised as an error, a misdirected text, a whisper in a quiet office asking you to say it again. Before this story ends, take a moment and tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced a mistake that unexpectedly changed your life? Jacob still misses Hannah. He always will. But he no longer carries the weight alone. And Margaret, once known only for her sharp decisions and unbreakable focus, became something more than a CEO. She became proof that even the most guarded hearts can open when they hear the right words at the right time. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you of someone you miss or a second chance you were given, please like, share, comment, and subscribe, but only if it truly meant something to you.